Tonight, we are going to explore a question so fundamental that most scientists have spent their careers trying to avoid it. Not because it is unimportant, not because it is unanswerable, but because it sits right at the intersection of physics, neuroscience, and philosophy, and whoever tries to take it seriously risks looking foolish to colleagues in all three fields at once. The question is this: is consciousness a thing the universe does, or is it a thing the universe is? Is awareness something that biological brains produce the way a furnace produces heat, a byproduct of a particular physical arrangement, something that exists only in heads and nowhere else? Or is consciousness something more fundamental than that, something written into the structure of reality itself, something that was present before brains existed and will persist after they are gone? For most of the 20th century, the mainstream scientific answer was the first one. Consciousness is what a brain does. It emerges from neural activity the way traffic jams emerge from cars, not located in any single car, but arising from their collective behavior. When the brain stops, consciousness stops. End of question. But over the past 30 years, a growing number of physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers have found themselves unable to make that answer work. Not because they want consciousness to be something mystical, but because the mathematics keeps pointing somewhere else. Because the theories built on the assumption that consciousness is purely a product of matter keep running into a wall that the theories cannot explain away. The wall has a name. The philosopher David Chalmers named it in 1995, and the name stuck. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, and understanding what that problem actually is, why it is genuinely hard in a way that distinguishes it from every other problem in science, is where we need to start. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why serious physicists are now taking seriously the idea that consciousness is not just something brains do, but something the universe does. That awareness might be as fundamental as space, time, and energy. That the universe might not simply contain beings who are conscious. The universe might, in some deep and precise sense, be consciousness. Before we get started, if you love exploring ideas like this as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It helps this channel reach more curious minds, and it means we can keep making content like this. Now, let us begin to understand why the consciousness question keeps forcing its way back into physics. You have to understand what David Chalmers meant by the hard problem, because most people who have heard of it have a slightly wrong picture of it. The hard problem is not about explaining how the brain works. Science has made extraordinary progress on understanding the brain, mapping which neural circuits are active during different mental states, identifying the chemical pathways involved in mood and attention and memory, charting the electrical patterns that accompany different forms of experience. All of that is real progress, and it matters. But all of it is what Chalmers calls the easy problems, not because they are simple, they are extraordinarily difficult, but because they are the kind of problems that science knows how to tackle. They are questions about function, mechanism, and behavior. Given enough data and computing power, they will yield. The hard problem is different in kind. The hard problem is not about how the brain processes information. It is about why processing information feels like anything. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does seeing red not just trigger certain wavelength-sensitive neurons and update certain cognitive representations, but actually look like something, have a quality, a redness that you experience from the inside? Why does the word lonely not just activate semantic processing networks, but sometimes land in the chest with a particular weight? Why is pain not just a nociceptive signal being routed through spinal cord and cortex, but something that hurts. The scientific story of mechanism, of neurons firing and chemicals binding and electrical patterns propagating, can describe everything happening in the brain from the outside. It cannot, without additional assumptions, explain why there is an inside at all. Philosophers have a technical term for the felt quality of conscious experience. They call it qualia, the redness of red, the sharpness of pain, the taste of coffee, the weight of grief. These are qualia, and the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why physical processes give rise to qualia at all. Why does information processing in the brain generate an inner experience? Why is there a subjective perspective accompanying the objective neural machinery? Chalmers' point was that no amount of additional neuroscience, however precise and detailed, could in principle answer this question, because any purely mechanistic description of the brain leaves out the very thing we are trying to explain. You can describe every neuron, every synapse, every ion channel, and at the end of the description, you still have not explained why any of it feels like anything. Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA and spent the later part of his career on consciousness, attempted to locate the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activity patterns that correspond to conscious awareness. He and his colleague Christof Koch made progress in identifying candidate neural correlates, particularly in regions of the prefrontal cortex and in a structure called the claustrum, a thin sheet of neurons beneath the cortex that Crick speculated might be a kind of conductor for conscious experience. But Crick was always honest about what this research could and could not show. Finding the neural correlate of consciousness, the brain pattern that corresponds to a conscious state, is not the same as explaining why that pattern is accompanied by experience rather than occurring in the dark. Correlation is not explanation. The hard problem survives the discovery of neural correlates because you still need to explain why those particular physical processes generate experience while others apparently do not. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, who is probably the most prominent scientific critic of the hard problem framing, has argued for decades that Chalmers is wrong, that the hard problem is an illusion, that consciousness is just what brains do, and the feeling that something more needs explaining is itself a product of confused intuition. Dennett's position is called eliminative materialism, and it is held with genuine philosophical rigor. But it has a feature that makes many people, including many philosophers and scientists who sympathize with its general direction, uncomfortable. It requires saying that the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the felt quality of experience, are not real phenomena requiring explanation, but illusions to be explained away. And there is something peculiar about explaining away the most directly known thing there is. You might doubt the existence of anything, but it is hard to doubt that there is experience happening right now, that there is something it is like to be reading these words. Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, bottoms out here. The one thing you cannot coherently deny is the existence of your own experience. So the hard problem stands, and the responses to it fall into two broad categories. Either consciousness is somehow special within the physical world, a higher order emergent property that arises when physical systems reach sufficient complexity, or consciousness is more fundamental than standard physics assumes, a basic feature of reality rather than a derived one. The first option is what most neuroscientists implicitly assume. The second option is what a growing number of physicists and philosophers are taking seriously. And the second option has a name that most people associate with crystals and New Age thinking, but that has a rigorous scientific formulation. The name is panpsychism, Panpsychism is the view that consciousness, or at least some form of proto-conscious experience, is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. Not that rocks think or electrons have rich inner lives, but that at the most basic level of physical reality, wherever there is something rather than nothing, there is something it is like to be that something, some minimal form of experience, some extremely primitive version of interiority that is built into matter at its most fundamental level, rather than arising mysteriously at some threshold of biological complexity. This is an ancient idea. It appears in various forms in ancient Greek philosophy, in the Stoic notion of pneuma as a universal intelligent substance pervading the cosmos, in Leibniz's monads, in Spinoza's dual aspect view of a single substance that has both physical and mental properties, in William James's radical empiricism, in Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. It has never entirely gone away, but for most of the 20th century, it was dismissed by mainstream science and philosophy as unscientific vitalism, the same kind of thinking that once posited an elan vital to explain the difference between living and non-living matter. Science had moved decisively toward a materialist view in which matter is just matter, following physical laws with no inner dimension, and consciousness was either a puzzle to be solved within that framework, or, for the more eliminativist thinkers, an illusion to be dissolved. What has changed over the past 30 years is that the hard problem has forced even skeptical philosophers and scientists to take panpsychism seriously as a logical response to a genuine puzzle. The argument is not mystical. It is actually quite straightforward. If you accept that consciousness is a real phenomenon, not an illusion to be explained away, and if you accept that at some level of physical description, consciousness appears to be present, the question is, at what level does it first appear, and why? If consciousness somehow arises from pure non-conscious matter at some threshold of complexity, you face an explanatory gap. You need to explain what it is about complex neural systems that produces consciousness when simpler systems apparently have none. And that gap is exactly the hard problem. You have not escaped it by pushing it down to a lower level. You have just postponed it. The panpsychist response is to say, eliminate the gap entirely by not postulating a level at which consciousness first appears. If proto-conscious properties are present at every level of physical reality, all the way down to the most elementary particles and fields, then there is no threshold to explain and no gap to bridge. Consciousness in complex organisms like humans is not a new thing that emerged from non-conscious matter. It is a particular kind of organization and integration of proto-conscious properties that were already there in the matter. The way that temperature is a property that emerges from the collective behavior of molecules that individually have kinetic energy, but not temperature. The property is new at the collective level, but it is not mysterious, because the elements it emerges from already had the relevant properties in proto-form. Among the most prominent contemporary defenders of panpsychism are the philosopher Philip Goff at Durham University, whose book, Galileo's Error, argues that panpsychism is the most scientifically respectable response to the hard problem, and David Chalmers himself, who has moved toward a version of panpsychism called property dualism, or naturalistic dualism, which holds that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe alongside mass, charge, and spin, not reducible to these properties, but lawfully related to them. Chalmers has said that he would not be surprised if the fundamental theory of consciousness turns out to look something like the psychophysical laws relating physical processes to conscious states, analogous to the physical laws relating physical quantities to each other. Goff's argument, presented in Galileo's Error, has an interesting historical dimension. Goff argues that the reason science ended up with a hard problem of consciousness is a historical accident going back to Galileo in the 17th century. When Galileo established the methodology of quantitative science, he explicitly excluded qualities from the domain of scientific description. Science would deal with quantities, with size, shape, number, position, motion, and their mathematical relationships. Qualities, the redness of red, the warmth of warmth, the taste of taste, were excluded from science's domain and assigned to the subjective realm of the observer. Galileo did this deliberately and for good reason. It allowed science to make the extraordinary quantitative progress of the past 4 centuries, but it also built in a blind spot. By banishing qualities from the physical description of the world at the very beginning, science guaranteed that it would never be able to explain where qualities come from. The hard problem is, on Goff's view, a consequence of the methodological choice Galileo made to exclude qualities from physics. Panpsychism is the correction to that error, the recognition that qualities, consciousness, experience were not absent from nature, but simply absent from our description of nature. Of all the theories that have been proposed to make consciousness scientifically tractable, integrated information theory, developed by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin, is probably the most mathematically precise and the most controversial. Tononi began developing IIT in the early 2000s, and the theory has gone through several versions, the most recent being IIT 4.0. What makes IIT remarkable is not just that it proposes an explanation for consciousness, but that it proposes a measure of consciousness, a number that can in principle be calculated for any physical system, and that tells you how conscious that system is. The measure is called phi, the Greek letter, and it quantifies something that Tononi calls integrated information. To understand what integrated information is, start with what consciousness feels like from the inside. Tononi's starting point is phenomenology, the description of the structure of experience itself, and he identifies several features that seem to be present in every conscious experience. First, every conscious experience is highly differentiated, meaning it is one specific experience out of an enormous number of possible experiences. Right now, you are having a particular experience, and it is distinguished from a vast number of other possible experiences you are not having. Second, every conscious experience is unified. You do not experience parts of the world in separate fragments that you then have to put together. You experience an integrated whole. The colors, shapes, sounds, feelings, thoughts, memories that are present right now are all part of a single unified experience, not a collection of separate experiences happening simultaneously in the same skull. Tononi's key insight was that these two features, differentiation and integration, can be captured mathematically by the concept of integrated information. A system has high integrated information if its parts work together as a unified whole in a way that generates more information jointly than the sum of their individual contributions. A system has low integrated information if it can be broken apart into components that operate relatively independently of each other. The mathematics Tononi uses to make this precise is borrowed from information theory, the field pioneered by Claude Shannon in the 1940s, which provides rigorous tools for measuring information and its flow through systems. Phi, in its simplest terms, measures how much information is generated by a system as a whole above and beyond the information generated by its parts independently. A system with high phi is one where the whole genuinely contains more information than the sum of its parts, where the integration between parts is doing real informational work. A system with phi equal to 0 is one that can be fully decomposed into independent components, a collection of parts that happen to be physically adjacent but do not truly function as a unified whole. Tononi's central claim is that a system is conscious if and only if it has non-zero phi, and the quantity of its consciousness is proportional to its phi value. This claim has some striking consequences. The human brain, with its billions of neurons connected by trillions of synapses in patterns of extraordinary intricacy, should have a very high phi value, reflecting the rich integrated information processing that underlies conscious experience. A simple thermostat, which has only two states, on and off, should have a very low phi value, approaching zero, reflecting its near complete decomposability into independent components. A silicon computer processor, despite performing computations of extraordinary complexity and speed, should also have a relatively low phi value, because its architecture is specifically designed to break computation into parallelizable components that can be processed independently and then combined, which is precisely the architecture that minimizes integration. That last point is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most counterintuitive predictions of IIT. A modern computer, despite performing calculations that dwarf the human brain in speed and precision, might be far less conscious than a sleeping child, or even a mouse, or possibly a bee, because its architecture is built for modularity and parallelism rather than integration. IIT says that what matters for consciousness is not computational power, but the particular kind of integrated, irreducible information processing that biological neural networks perform. A supercomputer running a perfect simulation of a human brain, IIT predicts, would not be conscious, because the simulation would run on hardware with low phi, regardless of what the software was simulating. Consciousness is not in the computation. It is in the physical substrate and its particular integration structure. IIT also makes a claim about where consciousness exists in the brain. Tononi and his collaborators have argued that the neural correlates of consciousness are located in what they call the posterior hot zone, a region in the back of the brain encompassing parts of the parietal, occipital, and temporal cortex. This region, which is deeply interconnected and shows high integrated information under analysis, is distinguished from the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain region most associated with planning, reasoning, and working memory. This is surprising, because the prefrontal cortex is usually thought of as the seat of higher cognition. But IIT predicts and experiments have suggested that the prefrontal cortex contributes to conscious content primarily through its connections to the posterior hot zone, and that activity in the prefrontal cortex alone, disconnected from this posterior region, is not sufficient for consciousness. One of the most elegant predictions of IIT is its account of unconscious states. During dreamless sleep or under general anesthesia, the phi value of the brain should drop dramatically, reflecting the collapse of integrated information processing as the brain's global coordination dissolves into more local, fragmented activity. And indeed, experiments by Tononi and colleagues using TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, combined with EEG recording, have shown exactly this. In a conscious brain, a magnetic pulse delivered to the cortex produces a complex ripple of electrical activity that propagates across the brain in an integrated way. In an unconscious brain, the same pulse produces a brief local response that does not propagate, dying out quickly at the stimulation site. The brain under anesthesia or in dreamless sleep stops functioning as an integrated whole, and Tononi argues this is precisely why consciousness disappears. Here is where integrated information theory becomes philosophically explosive. If consciousness is proportional to phi, and if phi can in principle be calculated for any physical system, then the question of whether the universe has consciousness is not a mystical speculation, but a mathematical question. You could, in principle, calculate the phi of the universe, and IT provides a specific answer to where consciousness exists and where it does not, based not on biology or complexity or behavior, but on the precise mathematical structure of integrated information. Tononi himself is careful about the cosmological implications of IIT, but he does not shy away from them. IIT is explicitly a form of panpsychism. It says that wherever there is non-zero phi, there is some degree of consciousness. And since phi can be non-zero for very simple physical systems, the theory implies that consciousness, in some minimal form, is far more widespread in the universe than biology alone would suggest. A single proton, isolated in space, might have a tiny non-zero phi value. A simple chemical compound might have a slightly higher one. A thermostat, even if very low, might have some phi. The universe is not divided into the conscious and the unconscious. It is a continuum of degrees of consciousness, with humans and other complex animals near the top of the observable spectrum and simple physical systems near the bottom, but not necessarily at zero. The physicist and mathematician Max Tegmark has developed a related perspective that he calls perceptronium, a term for the physical substrate of consciousness. Tegmark argues, following a line of reasoning similar to IIT's, that consciousness corresponds to certain physical patterns that have specific mathematical properties, and that these properties can be stated precisely enough to be falsifiable. Tegmark identifies 5 properties he believes define conscious matter. It stores information, it processes information, it is autonomous, it is integrated, and it is dynamical. These criteria, Tegmark argues, are met by certain physical systems and not by others, and the boundary between them is a scientific question amenable to empirical investigation. Tegmark goes further in his broader framework, the mathematical universe hypothesis, which holds that physical reality is a mathematical structure in the most literal sense possible. Not that the universe is described by mathematics, but that the universe is mathematics. Every mathematical structure that is logically consistent exists as a physical reality somewhere in the multiverse of all possible mathematical structures. In this framework, consciousness is one of the mathematical patterns that exist in the universe, and its relationship to the rest of the mathematical structure is determined by the same principles that determine all physical relationships. Consciousness is not a ghost haunting the machine. It is a particular kind of mathematical pattern that, when instantiated in the right physical substrate, constitutes experience. The cosmological question, whether the universe as a whole has non-zero phi and therefore some form of consciousness, is one that IIT does not definitively answer. The calculation would be extraordinarily difficult, probably impossible with current mathematical tools. But the structure of IIT makes the question scientifically meaningful rather than mystical. It transforms it from a question about the soul of the cosmos into a question about the integrated information processing structure of the physical universe. And given that the universe is a single interconnected system, in which, through the laws of quantum mechanics, every part is entangled with every other part across cosmic distances, the possibility that the universe as a whole has non-zero integrated information is not obviously absurd. To understand why physics itself keeps bumping into consciousness, you need to revisit the quantum measurement problem in this context. In quantum mechanics, a physical system is described before measurement by a wave function, a mathematical object that represents a superposition of all possible states the system could be in, each with some probability. When you measure the system, the wave function collapses to a single definite state, the one you actually observe. Before measurement, superposition. After measurement, definite outcome. The problem is explaining what counts as a measurement and what causes the collapse. John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, analyzed the measurement problem in his 1932 book, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. Von Neumann showed that the quantum mechanical equations describe the interaction between a quantum system and a measuring device as just another quantum interaction. The measuring device becomes entangled with the quantum system. The combined system is now in a superposition. To collapse that superposition, you need another measurement of the measuring device by some external apparatus. But that apparatus also becomes entangled and enters a superposition. You can continue this chain indefinitely until von Neumann pointed out that the chain has to stop somewhere. And the only place it can stop, von Neumann argued, is at the boundary between the physical world and the conscious observer, who is actually aware of the outcome. This is what physicists call von Neumann's cut, the dividing line between the quantum and the classical, between the superposition and the definite. Von Neumann's analysis does not prove that consciousness causes wave function collapse, but it does show that if you follow the logic of quantum mechanics consistently, the chain of physical systems in superposition terminates at the observer's conscious awareness. Consciousness on this reading is not a thing physics explains. It is the boundary condition at which physics operates. Eugene Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963, took von Neumann's analysis seriously and pushed it further with the thought experiment now called Wigner's friend. Wigner imagined a friend performing a quantum measurement inside a sealed laboratory. From the friend's perspective, the measurement produces a definite outcome. But from Wigner's perspective outside the laboratory, the entire system of friend plus laboratory plus quantum object is described by the wave function. From Wigner's perspective, the friend is in a superposition of having seen result A and having seen result B. When Wigner opens the laboratory door and asks his friend what happened, the friend reports a definite result. But the question is, when did that definiteness come into being? Was it when the friend made the measurement inside, implying the friend's consciousness collapsed the wave function? Or was it when Wigner opened the door? This thought experiment was experimentally realized by teams in Edinburgh and Geneva in 2019, and the results showed genuine quantum mechanical inconsistencies between what different observers could describe about the outcome, exactly as the thought experiment predicted. Wigner himself concluded from his thought experiment that consciousness must play a special role in quantum mechanics. He wrote about this in a famous 1967 essay called Remarks on the Mind-Body Question, where he argued that it is no longer possible to defend the view that the existence of mind is irrelevant to the formulation of the laws of physics. The sharp boundary between physics and mind, which Galileo's program implicitly assumed, had been dissolved by quantum mechanics from within physics itself. There is a newer and more subtle interpretation of quantum mechanics called cubism, pronounced cubism, which stands for quantum Bayesianism, developed primarily by the physicists Christopher Fuchs and Rudiger Schack and the philosopher of physics N. David Mermin. Cubism does not claim that consciousness causes collapse. It does something in some ways more radical. It reframes quantum mechanics entirely as a theory about the relationship between agents and the world, where agents are beings with experiences. In standard interpretations of quantum mechanics, the wave function is a description of some feature of the physical world. Cubism says that the wave function is a representation of an agent's beliefs about what they will experience when they interact with a physical system. The probabilities in quantum mechanics are not objective features of the world. They are subjective degrees of belief held by an agent, updated according to the rules of Bayesian probability theory when the agent has new experiences. When a quantum measurement is made, the wave function collapses, not because some physical process happens, but because the agent has an experience, and that experience updates their beliefs. The cubist interpretation is explicitly agent-centric in a way that gives experience a foundational role. Fuchs has described cubism as placing the agent, the entity that has experiences and makes decisions, at the center of the quantum formalism. In cubism, you cannot even formulate quantum mechanics without reference to agents, to beings that have experiences and hold beliefs and make measurements. The universe described by quantum mechanics is, on the cubist reading, not a universe that contains some agents as one component among others. It is a universe that is constituted, at the level of its physical description, by the experiences of agents. What quantum mechanics gives us is not a description of the world, but the structure of experience, the laws governing how agents update their beliefs based on their interactions with the world. In this sense, cubism is a quantum mechanical vindication of something close to the philosophical position that the structure of reality is, at the level accessible to physics, fundamentally experiential. There is another route through which the question of consciousness reaches cosmology, one that does not depend on the details of quantum mechanics or information theory, but on the large-scale structure of the universe and the specific values of its fundamental constants. The route is through the fine-tuning problem, and it is one of the most discussed and least resolved problems in modern cosmology. The fundamental constants of nature are numbers that appear in the equations of physics, and that cannot be derived from those equations. The speed of light, the gravitational constant, the mass of the electron, the strength of the electromagnetic force, the cosmological constant, which determines the rate at which the universe's expansion accelerates. What has struck physicists and cosmologists over the past 50 years is that these constants appear to be set with extraordinary precision to values that allow complex structures to exist. If the gravitational constant were slightly different, stars could not form. If the electromagnetic coupling constant were slightly different, atoms could not form. If the cosmological constant were even slightly larger than it is, the expansion of the universe would have been too fast for galaxies to coalesce before everything flew apart. The physicist Lee Smolin estimated that if you were to randomly choose values for the fundamental constants of nature, the probability of getting values that allow stars to form and sustain nuclear fusion would be about 1 in 10 to the power of 229. That is not a number you can intuit. It is a number that makes the odds of winning every lottery in human history simultaneously, every single day for 1 billion years, look like a certainty by comparison. There are broadly 3 responses to this fine-tuning. The first is that it is not really surprising, because the universe could not have been any other way, perhaps for reasons we do not yet understand. The second is the multiverse response, which says that our universe is one of a vast ensemble of universes with different values of the constants, and we find ourselves in a universe with life-permitting constants simply because we could not find ourselves anywhere else. The third response is that the fine-tuning is genuine evidence that the universe was in some sense arranged to produce complex structures and ultimately conscious beings. The physicist Brandon Carter, who coined the term anthropic principle in 1973, distinguished between the weak anthropic principle, which is simply the observation that we can only observe a universe compatible with our existence, and the strong anthropic principle, which suggests that the universe must have the properties that allow life to develop within it at some stage. The strong anthropic principle, taken seriously, implies something remarkable about the relationship between the universe and consciousness. It implies that the existence of conscious observers is not an accident in the universe, but in some sense a requirement, something the universe was built toward. John Wheeler developed a version of this idea that he called the participatory anthropic principle. Wheeler suggested that the universe requires observers not only to observe it, but to bring it into being in a retroactive quantum sense. On Wheeler's view, the universe bootstrapped its own existence by evolving consciousness, and that consciousness, through its observations, retroactively participated in making definite the quantum state of the universe from its earliest moments. The universe is not a structure that contains consciousness as one of its products. It is a participatory enterprise in which consciousness plays a constitutive role. Roger Penrose is one of the most remarkable scientists alive, a mathematician and physicist whose contributions span general relativity, cosmology, and the mathematics of quantum mechanics. His collaboration with Stephen Hawking on the singularity theorems of general relativity in the 1960s established some of the most important results in the mathematical theory of spacetime. And his 2 books on consciousness, The Emperor's New Mind in 1989 and Shadows of the Mind in 1994, put forward a theory of consciousness that drew on all of these fields and generated enormous controversy that has not subsided in the 30 years since. Penrose's argument is built on a mathematical result called Gödel's incompleteness theorems, proved by Kurt Gödel in 1931. Gödel showed that in any sufficiently powerful formal mathematical system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within that system. The system is necessarily incomplete. Penrose interpreted this as showing that human mathematical understanding cannot be captured by any formal computational system, because a human mathematician can, in principle, see the truth of Gödelian statements that the formal system cannot prove. If this is right, then human consciousness cannot be fully explained by any computational process, because any computational process is equivalent to a formal system and therefore subject to Gödel's limitations. Penrose concluded that whatever is responsible for human mathematical understanding must be non-algorithmic, meaning it cannot be captured by any set of rules that a computer could follow. And the only place in known physics where non-algorithmic processes might occur is in the collapse of the quantum wave function. Penrose proposed that consciousness involves a specific kind of quantum wave function collapse that is not purely random, but guided by quantum gravity, the yet undiscovered theory that unifies quantum mechanics and general relativity. This process, which Penrose calls objective reduction, would be non-algorithmic in precisely the sense needed to explain the non-computational aspects of human understanding. Stuart Hameroff, the anesthesiologist who collaborated with Penrose to develop the orchestrated objective reduction theory, proposed that the quantum processes relevant to consciousness occur in microtubules, protein filaments inside neurons that form part of the cytoskeleton. Hameroff had been interested in microtubules partly because they are involved in anesthesia, general anesthetic agents, which reliably abolish consciousness without affecting much of the brain's other activity, bind to tubulin proteins within microtubules. Hameroff argued that this was evidence that microtubules are specifically involved in producing consciousness, and that the quantum properties of tubulin could support the non-algorithmic processes Penrose's theory required. The OR theory has been criticized on the grounds that biological systems at brain temperature are too warm and noisy to maintain quantum coherence for the timescales needed. Quantum coherence is fragile, destroyed by interaction with the thermal environment on timescales orders of magnitude shorter than those of neural activity. But Hameroff and Penrose have responded that recent experimental results on quantum effects in warm biological systems, including the quantum coherence in photosynthesis, show that quantum effects in warm, wet systems are not as fragile as had been assumed. A 2022 paper by Bandyopadhyay's group in Japan reported evidence of quantum vibrations in microtubules. These results are not definitive, but they suggest that the dismissal of ORC-OR on thermal grounds may have been premature. The more neuroscience advances, the more sharply the explanatory gap comes into focus. This is not because neuroscience is failing. It is because neuroscience is succeeding so well at describing the mechanism of the brain that the absence of any connection between that mechanism and the felt quality of experience becomes more and more conspicuous. Consider what happens when you see the color red. The light of wavelengths around 700 nanometers enters your eye and stimulates the long wavelength cone photoreceptors in the retina. The signal travels along the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, where it is processed and relayed to the primary visual cortex. From there, the signal is distributed to higher visual areas that extract different features: color, form, motion, depth, and these streams are integrated in associative cortex regions. All of this can be described in extraordinary detail, down to the level of individual neurons and ion channels and neurotransmitters. But at no point in that description does the redness appear. The philosopher Joseph Levine described this in 1983 as the explanatory gap, a gap between the physical and the phenomenal that explanation cannot bridge. Chalmers took Levine's explanatory gap and elevated it to the hard problem, arguing that the gap is not just an expression of current ignorance that will close as science advances, but a principled gap that reflects a genuine feature of the relationship between physical description and phenomenal reality. The philosopher Thomas Nagel made the explanatory gap vivid in his 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, which has become one of the most cited papers in the philosophy of mind. Nagel argued that we can know everything about the neurophysiology of a bat's echolocation system, everything about how the bat processes sound and navigates through space using reflected ultrasonic pulses, without having the slightest idea what it is like to be a bat, what the bat's experience of echolocation is from the inside. And this ignorance is not just practical limitation. There is something about the subjective character of experience that makes it irreducible to objective scientific description, not because science is inadequate, but because the subjective and the objective are different in kind. Nagel extended this argument in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos, which argued that the emergence of consciousness through evolution is not satisfactorily explained by the standard neo-Darwinian picture of genetic variation and natural selection. Not because evolution did not happen, but because the standard account of how evolution works is purely physical and mechanical, and something purely physical and mechanical cannot in principle explain the emergence of subjectivity. Nagel proposed that the universe might have teleological tendencies, natural inclinations toward the development of consciousness and reason, built into its physical structure in a way that current science does not capture. This is a form of what philosophers call neutral monism, the view that the fundamental nature of reality is neither purely mental nor purely physical, but something that underlies both and gives rise to both depending on how it is organized and observed. Long before IT or quantum mechanics gave physicists a mathematical framework for thinking about consciousness as a cosmic phenomenon, a Jesuit priest and paleontologist named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin had a vision of the universe as a process of evolving consciousness that culminates in what he called the omega point, a sphere of maximal consciousness and complexity toward which all of cosmic history tends. Teilhard developed this vision over decades of scientific work and theological reflection, and published it in a book called The Phenomenon of Man, which was finished in 1938, but not published until after his death in 1955 because the Catholic Church suppressed it during his lifetime as doctrinally problematic. Teilhard was a trained paleontologist who worked on the discovery of Peking man and contributed to some of the most important fossil discoveries of the early 20th century. He accepted evolution completely and enthusiastically, and his project was to integrate the scientific story of evolution with a theological vision of cosmic purpose. His key insight was that evolution is not a random walk through possibility space, but a directional process that tends toward greater complexity, greater consciousness, and greater interiority. He called this tendency the law of complexity consciousness, the observation that as physical systems become more complex in their organization, they also develop a greater degree of inwardness, of interior life. Teilhard saw evolution as passing through successive phases, each characterized by a new level of complexity and consciousness. The geosphere, the physical world of matter and energy. The biosphere, the world of life, where physical complexity gave rise to biological organization and primitive experience. The noosphere, the sphere of mind, which emerged when the evolution of nervous systems produced beings capable of thought, reflection, and collective knowledge. Teilhard saw the development of the noosphere as a new geological epoch, the emergence of a planetary layer of thought as significant in the history of the Earth as the emergence of life itself. The Internet, the global brain, the interconnected web of human knowledge and communication, is something that Teilhard seemed to anticipate decades before it existed, as the material expression of the noosphere becoming denser and more integrated. The omega point is Teilhard's vision of the ultimate convergence of the noosphere, the point toward which the increasing complexity and integration of human thought and consciousness tends. Not the physical end of the universe, but the point of maximum consciousness, where all the strands of human knowing and loving and creating converge in a final synthesis. Whether or not one accepts the theological dimension of Teilhard's vision, the scientific core of it has found surprising resonance in contemporary discussions of consciousness and cosmology. His idea that increasing complexity is correlated with increasing consciousness maps directly onto the logic of IIT. His vision of the noosphere as a new phase of cosmic evolution anticipates discussions of the global brain and collective intelligence. His sense that the universe has a direction, that it tends toward consciousness rather than away from it, is exactly what the strong anthropic principle and the fine-tuning argument suggest. The physicist Frank Tipler developed a secular version of Teilhard's omega point in a 1994 book called The Physics of Immortality. Tipler argued that the omega point is not just a theological concept, but a physical singularity that general relativity predicts will occur at the end of time in a certain class of universe models. In Tipler's picture, the total information processing capacity of the universe increases without bound as the omega point is approached, and in the limit, the total amount of information processed becomes infinite. Tipler's argument is speculative and depends on specific cosmological models that most physicists do not accept, but it represents a serious attempt to give Teilhard's vision a precise physical content. Not everyone in neuroscience accepts IIIT's account of consciousness, and the most serious scientific competitor to IIT is global workspace theory, developed by the cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Bars in the 1980s and extended by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux at the Collège de France. The central idea of global workspace theory is that the brain consists of many specialized processing modules that operate largely in parallel and largely unconsciously. There is a module for visual processing, one for auditory processing, one for language, one for motor control. Each of these modules processes information rapidly and automatically, without any need for conscious awareness. What makes something conscious, on GWT's account, is when information from one of these specialized processors is broadcast widely across the brain through a kind of global workspace, a central hub of integration that makes information available to many other processes simultaneously. Dehaen's version of global workspace theory is highly specific about the neural substrate. He identifies the global workspace with a network of neurons in the prefrontal and parietal cortex that have long-range connections, allowing them to coordinate activity across many brain regions. When information ignites this network, triggering a cascade of synchronized activity across large areas of the brain, it becomes conscious. When information does not ignite the network, remaining local in specialized processors, it is processed unconsciously. In 2019, Dehaen and Tononi agreed to an adversarial collaboration, a planned set of experiments designed to distinguish between the predictions of global workspace theory and IIT. The preliminary results, published in 2023, were partially supportive of IIT and partially supportive of GWT, with some aspects of the data fitting each theory better than the other. The two theories make different predictions about where in the brain the critical activity for consciousness occurs. IIT predicts the posterior hot zone. GWT predicts the prefrontal global workspace network. The 2023 data showed that activity in the posterior cortex tended to precede conscious reports slightly, a result more consistent with IIT. But long-range frontal activity also correlated with consciousness in ways more consistent with GWT. The debate between IIT and GWT matters for the question of cosmic consciousness because the two theories have very different implications. IIT implies panpsychism. Any system with non-zero phi is conscious. GWT implies almost the opposite. On GWT, consciousness requires specifically the kind of long-range cortical broadcasting architecture that vertebrate brains have. Which theory is right remains scientifically undecided. The neuroscientist Christof Koch, who has worked closely with Tononi on IIT, has said that he believes IIT is the best candidate theory for explaining consciousness, but that a definitive decision between IIT and its competitors is probably a decade or more away. Near-death experiences present a different and more challenging set of observations for any theory of consciousness. These are reports given by people who have been clinically dead for short periods, typically following cardiac arrest, and then resuscitated. A consistent set of features appears in these reports across cultures and centuries. The sense of floating above the body and observing resuscitation attempts from outside it, moving through a tunnel toward a bright light, encountering deceased relatives, a panoramic review of one's life, a sense of deep peace and reluctance to return. These reports are given by people who were, by clinical measures, unconscious or briefly dead, with no measurable brain activity during part or all of the experience. The standard scientific explanation is that near-death experiences are generated by a brain under extreme stress, a dying or recently revived brain producing hallucinations. As neurons misfire under hypoxia, elevated carbon dioxide, or the massive release of neurotransmitters that occurs during physiological crisis. This explanation is plausible for many of the features of near-death experiences. The tunnel and light might correspond to the pattern of retinal ischemia. The life review might correspond to hippocampal activity that accompanies severe stress. The euphoria and sense of peace might correspond to endogenous opioid and serotonin release. But there is a subset of near-death experience reports that are harder to explain this way. These are cases where people report specific, verifiable details about events that occurred during the period when their brain activity was either absent or insufficient to support consciousness in any standard model. Cases where resuscitated patients accurately described specific actions and conversations that occurred in the operating room, while their hearts were stopped and their EEGs were flat. The most famous case study in this category is that of Pam Reynolds, a musician who underwent a procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest in 1991, during which her body was cooled to 15 degrees Celsius, her heart was stopped, and her brain activity was completely suppressed by monitoring. Reynolds later reported accurate details of the surgical procedure, the instruments used, and conversations between surgeons that occurred during the procedure, at a time when by every physical measure, her brain should have been incapable of generating any experience. The cardiologist Pim van Lommel published a large prospective study of near-death experiences in The Lancet in 2001, following 344 cardiac arrest patients who were successfully resuscitated. About 18% of them reported near-death experiences with the characteristic features, and some reported verifiable out-of-body perceptions. Van Lommel concluded that the relationship between consciousness and the brain is not one of simple production, where the brain generates consciousness the way a generator produces electricity, but might be better understood as one of transmission, where the brain serves as a kind of receiver or filter for consciousness that has some existence independent of brain function. Sam Parnia at New York University has pursued similar research with his AWARE study, collecting cases of apparently accurate out-of-body perception during cardiac arrest. These findings are genuinely unresolved, but the data is not dismissible, and it points toward the possibility that consciousness is not simply identical with brain activity in the way that most neuroscientists assume. Federico Fagan, who invented the microprocessor and founded several semiconductor companies, published a book in 2021 called Irreducible, in which he develops a theory of consciousness grounded in his experience as a physicist and engineer, but arriving at conclusions that place him firmly in the panpsychist camp. Fagan's key insight, developed over years of thinking about what his own experience as a conscious engineer means in the context of the information processing systems he built, is that consciousness involves not just information processing, but self-referential awareness, an ability to know oneself that cannot be reduced to any information processing architecture, however complex. Fagan distinguishes between symbols, which carry meaning only for conscious observers, and signals, which are purely physical patterns with no intrinsic meaning. A computer processes signals. A conscious mind processes symbols. The difference is that symbols require a meaning giver, a conscious being for whom the symbol stands for something. And the only entity that can make symbols meaningful, for Fagan, is consciousness itself. You cannot get symbols from pure signal processing. You cannot get meaning from pure mechanism. And therefore, wherever meaning exists, wherever symbols are genuinely symbolic rather than just physical patterns, their consciousness is present. This argument connects to John Wheeler's phrase it from bit, the idea that at the most fundamental level, physical reality is informational. Physical things arise from information. The distinction between observer and observed, between the physical world and the mind that perceives it, breaks down at the quantum level because quantum mechanics describes not objects with definite properties, but information about possible measurement outcomes. If the universe is fundamentally informational, and if information requires a conscious interpreter to be meaningful, then consciousness is woven into the informational fabric of the universe in a way that cannot be extracted without pulling the fabric apart. Space-time carries the imprint of everything that has happened in it, in the curvature of its geometry, in the pattern of its fields. It is, in this sense, a kind of memory. And a memory that shapes what happens next is something that begins to look like a rudimentary form of knowing. One of the most radical contemporary theories of consciousness and reality was developed by the cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman at the University of California, Irvine. Hoffman's interface theory of perception holds that what we perceive is not reality, as it is but an interface designed by evolution to help us survive, not to show us the truth. Just as the icons on a computer desktop do not resemble the transistors and voltage levels that underlie them, the objects we perceive, the tables and chairs and other people, do not resemble the underlying physical reality they correspond to. Evolution has shaped our perceptions to track fitness payoffs, not truth. The world as we perceive it is a user interface, and behind the interface is something that our perceptions have no means to accurately represent. Hoffman's more radical claim is that space-time itself, the four-dimensional fabric of physical reality that Einstein's relativity describes, is not fundamental. It is part of the interface. The underlying reality is, on Hoffman's view, a network of conscious agents interacting with each other, and space-time, along with all the physical objects we perceive in it, is the phenomenal representation of those interactions. Consciousness, in Hoffman's framework, is not produced by the physical world. The physical world is produced by the interactions of conscious agents. This inverts the standard materialist picture completely. Instead of matter giving rise to mind, mind gives rise to the appearance of matter. Hoffman has developed this framework into a precise mathematical theory, using the tools of evolutionary game theory and a formalism he calls conscious agent networks. He argues that the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics, particularly the way quantum objects do not have definite properties before measurement, is exactly what you would expect from an interface reality that does not fully specify the underlying conscious network until a conscious agent interacts with it. The weirdness of quantum mechanics, on Hoffman's view, is a feature of being conscious agents interacting with an interface that is not built to show us the underlying reality. Hoffman's theory is controversial and has been criticized on various grounds, including that it makes it unclear how we should understand the apparent success of physics in describing the world, if the world physics describes is just an interface. But the theory has attracted serious attention from both physicists and philosophers, and it represents one of the most thoroughgoing attempts to take seriously the idea that consciousness is not a product of physical reality, but a constituent of it. It is important, as with everything we explore on this channel, to be honest about where the science stands and where it does not. The theory that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe is taken seriously by a significant and growing number of physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers, but it is not the majority view. Most working scientists still operate under the assumption that consciousness is produced by the brain through mechanisms that we do not yet fully understand, but that in principle admit of a mechanical explanation. The hard problem is acknowledged, but the majority response to it is that we simply need more neuroscience, not a new theory of reality. What has changed over the past 30 years is that the minority position has become significantly more rigorous and more defensible. IIT is a mathematically precise theory that makes empirical predictions, some of which have already been tested. The quantum measurement problem is a genuine issue in the foundations of physics that no consensus interpretation has resolved, and several serious interpretations give observers, and therefore consciousness, a non-trivial role. The fine-tuning of the fundamental constants is a real feature of the universe that demands explanation, and consciousness-involving explanations are among the candidate responses. The planned adversarial collaboration between IIT and global workspace theory, which produced its first set of results in 2023, is an example of the kind of rigorous empirical testing that will eventually narrow the field of viable theories. More such collaborations are needed, and more experimental techniques. The development of quantum neuroscience, the application of quantum information theory to neuroscience questions, is an emerging field that may provide new tools for testing whether quantum effects in the brain are relevant to consciousness. The development of more precise measures of integrated information in real neural systems is another frontier that several laboratories are pursuing. There is also a growing conversation between physicists working on quantum foundations and philosophers and neuroscientists working on consciousness. This conversation, which was rare 20 years ago, is now producing genuine intellectual cross-pollination. Physicists who have spent their careers thinking about the measurement problem are finding that their thinking converges with that of philosophers who have been working on the hard problem. The possibility that these two long-standing puzzles, what causes quantum collapse and what produces consciousness, might be aspects of the same underlying issue, is being taken seriously in ways it was not a generation ago. One of the deepest puzzles in the neuroscience of consciousness is what researchers call the binding problem. The brain processes information about the world in highly specialized, anatomically separated regions. Visual information about color is processed in one area. Information about shape is processed in another. Motion in yet another. Sound is processed in the auditory cortex. Smell in the olfactory cortex. Touch in the somatosensory cortex. All of this processing happens simultaneously in dozens of specialized regions spread across the brain. And yet, what you experience is a single, unified perception. Right now, you are experiencing sight, sound, memory, feeling, thought, all of it integrated into one seamless conscious moment. How does the brain bind all of this separated processing into a single unified experience? This is the binding problem, and it has no fully satisfying solution in standard neuroscience. The most popular proposed mechanism involves synchronized oscillations, particularly gamma oscillations, at around 40 cycles per second, in which neurons across widely separated brain regions oscillate in phase with each other. The synchrony links the separate processing streams, creating temporary assemblies of neurons that collectively represent unified perceptual objects and experiences. The evidence for gamma synchrony in conscious perception is real and robust. But critics have pointed out that synchrony is correlational, not explanatory. Even if synchronized oscillations accompany unified experience, you still need to explain why synchrony produces unity of experience rather than just coordinated processing that could in principle occur without any inner dimension. IIT addresses the binding problem directly and elegantly. On IIT's account, the unity of conscious experience is not produced by a binding mechanism. It is identical with the integrated information structure itself. The reason your experience of color and shape and sound and feeling is unified into one experience is that these processing streams are woven together in a single hi-fi integrated structure. The unity is the integration. You do not need a separate mechanism to bind the parts together, because the parts are never really separate in the first place. They are components of a single system whose integration is what constitutes the unified experience. The binding problem dissolves in IIT because what it calls binding is simply what hi-fi looks like from the inside. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Ned Block has argued for a distinction between two kinds of consciousness that is relevant here. He distinguishes between what he calls phenomenal consciousness, which is the felt quality of experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the kind of consciousness that the hard problem is about, and access consciousness, which is the availability of information for reasoning, reporting, and the control of behavior. Access consciousness is what standard cognitive science and global workspace theory describe. It is the making available of information across the global workspace, the broadcasting that makes information reportable and usable. Phenomenal consciousness is what IIT and panpsychism are about. It is the felt quality that accompanies that broadcasting. Bloch's distinction matters because it suggests that the study of consciousness requires two separate explanatory frameworks. Understanding the neural mechanisms of access consciousness is within the reach of standard cognitive neuroscience and global workspace theory. Understanding phenomenal consciousness requires the deeper theoretical framework that IIT and its competitors are trying to provide. The two kinds of consciousness are empirically correlated because in humans, access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness tend to go together, but they may be conceptually and potentially empirically distinguishable. There are cases where information seems to be accessed without being felt, like unconscious visual processing that influences behavior without producing any experience. And there are possibly cases where experience occurs without access, like the felt quality of a peripheral sound that you are not attending to and could not report in detail. Panpsychism faces its own deep problem, which philosophers call the combination problem. If proto-conscious experience is a fundamental feature of elementary particles like electrons and quarks, how do the proto-experiences of billions of such particles combine to produce the rich, unified experience of a human mind? It is not obvious that adding proto-experiences together produces larger experiences any more than adding zeros together produces a non-zero sum. The combination problem is in some ways the panpsychist mirror of the hard problem. For the materialist, the hard problem is, how does non-conscious matter produce consciousness? For the panpsychist, the combination problem is, how do elementary proto-experiences combine into complex experiences? Several responses to the combination problem have been developed. Philip Goff argues for what he calls constitutive panpsychism, in which the experiences of larger wholes are constituted by, and not merely correlated with, the experiences of their parts. The experience of the whole is not added to the experiences of the parts from outside. It is built from the parts in a way that Goff argues can be made precise within the framework of IIT. The phi of the whole system is a measure of how much the experiences of the parts are transformed and integrated in the process of constituting the experience of the whole. High phi means the whole genuinely transcends its parts in terms of integrated information. And this transcendence is what produces rich experience from simpler proto-experiences. Alfred North Whitehead, whose process philosophy is perhaps the most systematic attempt to build a panpsychist metaphysics, had a different response to the combination problem. For Whitehead, reality consists not of substances with properties, but of events, which he called actual occasions, each of which is a momentary act of experience. More complex entities, including humans, are what Whitehead called societies of actual occasions, complex organizations of simpler experiential events. The experience of a society is not simply the sum of the experiences of its member occasions, because the occasions interact and influence each other in ways that create genuinely new patterns of experience at the level of the society. The human mind, on Whitehead's view, is a very highly organized society of occasions whose experience emerges from the rich mutual interaction and prehension of its components. Galen Strawson, a philosopher at the University of Texas, who has been one of the most forceful advocates of panpsychism, has argued that the combination problem, while real, is no harder than the hard problem itself. In fact, he argues, it is the same problem viewed from a different angle. The hard problem is the problem of how non-conscious matter produces consciousness. The combination problem is the problem of how simpler experiences combine into more complex ones. Both are versions of the question of how one kind of thing gives rise to another kind of thing. Strawson argues that the combination problem is actually easier than the hard problem, because at least in the combination problem, we are combining like with like, experiences with experiences, rather than trying to derive something genuinely new from something genuinely different. There is a connection between the consciousness question and the arrow of time that has not been fully explored, but that hints at deep relationships. We discussed the arrow of time in our earlier exploration of retrocausality, where we found that the fundamental laws of physics are time-symmetric and that the apparent direction of time arises from thermodynamics and the low entropy initial state of the universe. But consciousness introduces a different arrow of time that may be relevant. The arrow of memory, the arrow of experience. Conscious experience is fundamentally asymmetric in time in a way that goes beyond thermodynamics. We remember the past and not the future. We experience the present as a moving boundary between a fixed past and an open future. We feel ourselves to be agents who can affect the future but not the past. These features of conscious experience are not explained by thermodynamics alone, because thermodynamics tells us about the statistical direction of entropy increase, but does not tell us about the felt quality of temporal experience, the sense of the present moving forward, the felt difference between memory and anticipation. Some philosophers and physicists have argued that consciousness is actually constitutive of the arrow of time in some deeper sense. On this view, the distinction between past and future is not just a statistical fact about entropy, but a feature of the experiential structure of conscious beings. The past is what is remembered. The future is what is anticipated. And memory and anticipation are features of consciousness, not just of physical time. If consciousness is fundamental to the universe, and if the universe as a whole has some form of awareness, then the arrow of time might be connected to the directional nature of cosmic experience in a way that pure thermodynamics does not capture. Carlo Rovelli, the loop quantum gravity physicist whose book The Order of Time we discussed earlier, has argued that time itself emerges from the interaction between conscious beings and the thermal environment they are embedded in. In Rovelli's picture, a perfectly isolated system has no time, or rather, all moments are equivalent to it, because the timeless Wheeler-DeWitt equation governs fundamental physics. Time emerges when there is a distinction between the system and its environment, when there is a thermal gradient, and when there is a perspective, an observer who interacts with the system from outside. On Rovelli's view, time is not a feature of the universe itself, but a feature of the relationship between observers and the universe. And this means that in a universe without observers, without consciousness, there would be no time in any physically meaningful sense. This connection between time and consciousness is one of the most speculative frontiers of the field, and it is too early to say whether it will lead anywhere rigorous. But it illustrates the way in which the consciousness question, once you take it seriously, ramifies throughout physics in unexpected ways. The questions of what time is, what causality is, what measurement is, what observation is, what information is, all turn out to be entangled with the question of what consciousness is, and none of them can be fully answered without taking the others seriously. In the past 2 decades, neuroscience has developed a range of powerful new tools for studying the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain activity patterns that correspond to conscious states. These tools include high-resolution fMRI, which measures blood oxygen levels as a proxy for neural activity with millimeter spatial resolution, high-density EEG, which measures electrical activity at the scalp, with millisecond temporal resolution, single-unit recording in patients with implanted electrodes, which measures the activity of individual neurons, and TMS combined with EEG, which allows both stimulation and measurement of the brain's response. Some of the most striking results from this research concern the contrast between conscious and unconscious visual processing. Stanislas Dehaene and his colleagues have conducted a series of experiments using what is called the attentional blink paradigm, in which two targets are presented in rapid succession, and subjects miss the second target when it follows too closely after the first. By comparing the neural activity during seen and unseen targets, matched for all other variables, Dehaene's group found a striking difference. Unseen stimuli produce local neural activity in sensory areas, but no global ignition, no widespread coordinated response across the brain. Seen stimuli produce a sudden ignition, a rapid cascade of activity spreading from sensory areas through prefrontal and parietal regions associated with a high amplitude late component of the EEG signal at around 300 milliseconds after the stimulus. This ignition response has the character of an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Below the threshold, perception does not occur. Above the threshold, it does, suddenly and completely. This is consistent with global workspace theory's picture of consciousness as a sudden recruitment of the global workspace by sufficiently strong and attended stimuli. But the specific neural dynamics of the ignition, the way it spreads and the regions it involves, have been more consistent with IIT's prediction that the posterior cortex is the critical region than with GWT's emphasis on prefrontal broadcasting. Christof Koch has spent decades searching for what he calls the minimal sufficient neural condition for a specific conscious experience, the smallest neural circuit that is both necessary and sufficient to produce a particular conscious content. His approach, which follows directly from IIT's framework, focuses on the posterior hot zone and its specific circuit-level organization. Koch and his collaborators have found evidence that specific patterns of activity in areas like the visual cortex, the parietal cortex, and the temporal cortex correspond to specific conscious contents, and that disrupting these areas specifically disrupts the corresponding conscious contents while leaving other aspects of behavior intact. One of the most fascinating recent developments in the neural correlates of consciousness research is the work on anesthesia. Different anesthetic agents produce unconsciousness through different molecular mechanisms, and by comparing the neural effects of different agents, researchers have begun to disentangle the specific neural changes responsible for the loss of consciousness from the other effects of anesthesia. The common feature across different anesthetic agents seems to be the disruption of the integration of information across brain regions, consistent with IIT's prediction. Ketamine, propofol, halothane, and other agents differ in their molecular targets, but converge on a reduction of long-range cortical communication and a fragmentation of integrated information processing. One of the most significant and most practically consequential implications of taking consciousness seriously as a scientific question is the question of which animals are conscious and to what degree. This is not a question about language or about the ability to pass behavioral tests for self-awareness. It is the deeper question of whether there is something it is like to be a dog, a fish, an insect, an octopus, whether, when a crayfish is placed in a stressful situation and shows signs of anxiety that are alleviated by anxiolytic drugs, there is a felt component to what it is experiencing. Whether the nociception in a fish, the neural response to tissue damage, is accompanied by pain in any sense we would recognize, or whether it is pure reflex without any felt quality. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a prominent group of neuroscientists assembled at a conference organized by the physicist Stephen Hawking, stated that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. The declaration was cautious in its claims, but significant in its acknowledgement that the question of animal consciousness deserves serious scientific attention, and that the evidence for consciousness in at least birds and mammals is strong. Since then, the evidence base has expanded to include evidence for pain experience in fish, for emotional states in invertebrates, and for surprisingly complex cognitive and potentially experiential capacities in cephalopods, particularly octopuses. IIT has specific predictions about animal consciousness. A system's consciousness is determined by its phi, its integrated information, and phi depends on the specific connectivity and architecture of the neural substrate rather than simply on its size or complexity. This means that some animals with relatively small nervous systems might have higher phi than would be expected from their size, if their connectivity patterns are highly integrated. Conversely, some large-brained animals might have lower phi than expected if their architecture is more modular. The research to actually calculate phi for different animal nervous systems is in its early stages, but the framework IIT provides for asking the question is more principled than any purely behavioral approach. The philosopher Peter Singer, in his foundational work on animal ethics, argued that the capacity for suffering is the relevant criterion for moral consideration, and that many animals clearly satisfy this criterion based on behavioral and physiological evidence. IIT adds a theoretical framework for understanding why certain animals suffer while others might not, grounding the moral question in a specific physical measure. If we can eventually calculate phi for different animals with reasonable precision, and if phi is indeed the measure of consciousness, then questions about which animals deserve moral consideration become empirical questions in a way they have never been before. The octopus deserves special mention in any discussion of consciousness and animal experience. Octopuses are mollusks, and their last common ancestor with vertebrates was over 600 million years ago, long before the evolution of any centralized nervous system. And yet octopuses have evolved independently, a nervous system of extraordinary complexity, with about 500 million neurons, larger than the nervous systems of most vertebrates, organized in a distributed way, with most neurons in the arms rather than in the central brain. Octopuses can solve complex puzzles, use tools, play, display what appear to be emotional responses, and have been observed in remarkable recent research to show what appear to be the neural signatures of REM sleep, including rapid eye movements and skin color changes, reminiscent of the active dreaming of vertebrates. If octopuses dream, then consciousness in some form has evolved twice independently on Earth, which is among the strongest evidence that the emergence of consciousness is something the universe does reliably, not a one-time accident. The consciousness question is moving more rapidly than most people realize, from being a purely philosophical debate to being an empirical scientific question with increasingly precise tools for investigation. The next decade or two is likely to see progress on several fronts that will sharpen our understanding of what consciousness is and where it exists. The first front is the continued development and testing of IIT. The adversarial collaboration between IIT and global workspace theory, which produced its first results in 2023, is ongoing. The second phase of the collaboration involves larger data sets, more experimental paradigms, and more sophisticated measures of integrated information in real neural tissue. Crucial among these is the development of practical methods for estimating phi in real brain circuits, which is computationally intractable for the whole brain, but potentially feasible for smaller circuits. If a measure of phi that is practically computable can be validated against behavioral and physiological markers of consciousness, IIT will have taken a major step toward empirical testability. The second front is quantum neuroscience. Several groups are now investigating whether quantum effects in the brain are relevant to neural computation and to consciousness. The tools for this investigation are becoming increasingly precise. Quantum biology has established that quantum coherence can survive in warm, wet biological environments, at least for timescales of hundreds of femtoseconds to picoseconds. Whether this is relevant to timescales of neural computation, which operate on millisecond timescales, remains unclear, but new experimental approaches, including quantum sensing techniques using nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond, are beginning to be applied to biological systems with unprecedented sensitivity. The third front is the study of consciousness in patients with disorders of consciousness, including minimally conscious states and vegetative states, using the tools of IIT and global workspace theory. These patients represent a tragic natural experiment in consciousness, where behavioral evidence of consciousness is absent or severely compromised, but neural activity of varying kinds is present. The ability to assess the phi of neural activity in these patients, or to assess whether global ignition responses are present, could provide both theoretical evidence about the neural basis of consciousness and practical tools for assessing residual consciousness in patients who cannot communicate. The fourth front is the theoretical development of quantum theories of consciousness, including the further development and testing of OR and competing quantum mind theories. Recent advances in quantum biology and in quantum computing are providing new mathematical tools for thinking about quantum coherence in complex systems, and these tools are beginning to be applied to neuroscience questions. Whether Penrose and Hameroff's specific predictions about microtubule quantum states can be tested experimentally is a question that several groups are working on. And the fifth front, the most ambitious and the most speculative, is the development of a physical theory of consciousness that can be placed alongside the other fundamental theories of physics, a set of psychophysical laws relating physical processes to conscious states in the way that Maxwell's equations relate electric charges to electromagnetic fields, or Einstein's equations relate matter and energy to space-time curvature. Chalmers identified this as the goal of the science of consciousness, and Tononi's IIT is the most developed candidate so far. Whether IIT will ultimately prove correct, whether a better theory will emerge, or whether the answer will require conceptual tools that have not yet been invented, is one of the most genuinely open questions in contemporary science. It is worth pausing, as we approach the end of tonight's exploration, to notice a remarkable convergence. The idea that consciousness is fundamental to the universe, that the cosmos is in some sense aware of itself, that matter and mind are not separate substances, but aspects of a single underlying reality, is not a new idea born in physics laboratories. It is one of the oldest ideas in human thought, and it is striking how closely some of the most ancient formulations of this idea resemble the implications of contemporary physics and information theory. The Vedantic tradition of Indian philosophy, which dates back at least 3,000 years, holds that the ultimate nature of reality is a single universal consciousness called Brahman, from which the apparent diversity of the world arises through a process called Maya, often translated as illusion, but better understood as the creative power of consciousness to generate the appearance of multiplicity and separation from underlying unity. The individual self, the Atman, is not separate from Brahman, but is Brahman experiencing itself from a particular perspective. This picture, in which individual consciousness is not separate from cosmic consciousness, but is its local expression, is strikingly close to what IIT's panpsychist implications suggest, and to the participatory universe vision of Wheeler. The Taoist tradition of Chinese philosophy which dates back to at least the 5th century BCE, describes the fundamental nature of reality as the Tao, a principle of dynamic unity that underlies all apparent opposites and all apparent separations. The Tao is not a thing or a being, but a process, the process of the universe being itself, and consciousness is not separate from this process, but is its most refined and aware expression. The sage in the Taoist tradition is not someone who has acquired special knowledge from outside, but someone who has recognized their own participation in the Tao, their own identity with the cosmic process that they had always already been part of. The Western philosophical tradition has its own versions of this convergence. Spinoza's monism, in which there is only one substance with two attributes, thought and extension, mind and matter, which are the same substance seen from different perspectives, anticipates the neutral monism and dual aspect theories that contemporary philosophers of mind are developing as responses to the hard problem. Leibniz's monadology, in which the universe consists of simple substances called monads that are fundamentally mental in character, and in which the physical world is the appearance of mental reality viewed from outside, anticipates panpsychism in a form that is technically very sophisticated. William James's radical empiricism, in which experience rather than matter is the fundamental stuff of reality, anticipated both IIT and cubism by a century. What these ancient traditions and these modern theories share is not just the conclusion that consciousness is fundamental. They share the intuition that the separation between observer and observed, between self and world, between mind and matter, is less absolute than everyday experience suggests. That at some deeper level of reality, the knower and the known are part of the same thing. That consciousness is not a window onto the world, but a mode of the world's being. That what the universe is doing when it produces beings who wonder at their own existence is what it was doing all along, just with enough complexity to notice. As we have traveled through both the physics of consciousness tonight and the foundations of quantum mechanics in our earlier explorations, a question has been quietly building in the background. The hard problem and the quantum measurement problem have been treated as separate puzzles in the scientific literature. But there are growing reasons to think they might be the same puzzle seen from different angles. The hard problem asks, why do physical processes produce experience? The measurement problem asks, what role do observers play in determining the definite outcomes of quantum measurements? Both questions resist every attempt to answer them using purely physical, non-mentalistic language. Both questions seem to require, at the end of the explanatory chain, something that is not just more physics, but a reference to the perspective of a conscious being. The physicist Henry Stapp at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has argued explicitly that the hard problem and the measurement problem are two sides of the same coin. Stapp's interpretation of quantum mechanics, which he has developed over 4 decades, places mental events at the center of the quantum measurement process. In Stapp's picture, which draws on von Neumann's chain but develops it further, the world consists of a continuous flow of quantum events, each of which is a transition from a quantum superposition to a definite classical outcome. These transitions are not purely physical. They are psychophysical events, events that have both a physical aspect, the change in the quantum state, and a mental aspect, the experience of the outcome by a conscious observer. The hard problem and the measurement problem are both manifestations of the same underlying psychophysical structure of reality. This is a controversial position, and most quantum physicists do not accept it. But it illustrates the way in which taking both the hard problem and the measurement problem seriously, rather than trying to dissolve one or the other, leads naturally to a picture of the universe in which physics and mind are not separate domains, but interlocked aspects of a single reality. And this interlocking is not metaphorical or approximate. It is, if Stapp and the others who have developed similar views are right, built into the very structure of the fundamental equations of quantum mechanics. The philosopher of mind and quantum theorist Paavo Pilkkonen at the University of Helsinki has developed a related position that draws on David Bohm's implicate order. Pilkkonen argues that Bohm's pilot wave interpretation of quantum mechanics, which treats the quantum potential as a real physical field that guides the motion of particles, naturally accommodates a role for mind in the structure of physics. In Bohm's picture, the quantum potential carries what Bohm called active information. Information that is not just passive data, but actively organizes the behavior of matter. Pilkkonen argues that this active information is the physical correlate of mental activity, that the quantum potential is the physical expression of the mind-like dimension that Bohm's implicate order attributes to fundamental reality. Mind is not added to physics from outside. It is the active, organizing, information-carrying dimension of physics itself. One of the most precise and most puzzling fine-tuning problems in physics is the cosmological constant problem, which we touched on earlier in the context of dark energy. The cosmological constant is the energy density of empty space, the intrinsic energy that the vacuum possesses even in the absence of any matter or radiation. Einstein introduced it into his equations of general relativity in 1917 to make the universe static, then abandoned it when Hubble discovered the universe was expanding. In 1998, the discovery that the universe's expansion was accelerating brought the cosmological constant back, now identified with the dark energy that drives the acceleration. The value of the cosmological constant is extraordinarily small in natural units. In units where the other fundamental constants of physics take values of order 1, the cosmological constant is about 10 to the minus 120, one followed by 120 zeros in the denominator. This is the famous cosmological constant problem, the worst fine-tuning problem in physics. Quantum field theory predicts that the vacuum energy should be of order 1 in natural units. The observed value is 120 orders of magnitude smaller. The discrepancy between prediction and observation is larger than for any other physical quantity in the history of science. Something is canceling the vacuum energy to extraordinary precision, leaving a residual that is enormously smaller than the natural scale. Why is this relevant to consciousness? Because the cosmological constant is one of the parameters that must be fine-tuned for complex structures to exist in the universe, and therefore for consciousness to arise. If the cosmological constant were much larger than its actual value, the expansion of the universe would have been too fast for matter to clump under gravity, and no galaxies, stars, planets, or life would have formed. The fact that the cosmological constant is so precisely small, so precisely right for life, is part of the fine-tuning argument. And the cosmological constant problem, the fact that quantum field theory predicts a value 120 orders of magnitude too large, suggests that there is a mechanism at work in the universe that is not yet understood. A mechanism that tunes the vacuum energy to a value compatible with the emergence of complex structures and ultimately of consciousness. Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1979, made a remarkable prediction in 1987. Before dark energy was discovered, Weinberg argued that if the cosmological constant were much larger than a certain value, galaxies could not form. Using the anthropic principle, he predicted that the observed value of the cosmological constant should be near the maximum compatible with galaxy formation. In 1998, when dark energy was discovered and the cosmological constant measured, its value was found to be very close to Weinberg's predicted maximum. This is one of the few successful predictions of the anthropic principle, and it suggests that the existence of observers, of conscious beings, played a role in selecting the value of the cosmological constant among the possible values in whatever ensemble of universes the anthropic principle invokes. One of the most fruitful developments in theoretical physics over the past 20 years has been the deep connection between quantum information theory and fundamental physics. This connection emerged most dramatically from the study of black holes, where the apparent paradox of information loss in Hawking radiation led to a decades-long debate about the relationship between information, entropy, and the fundamental structure of space-time. The resolution of this debate, still ongoing but trending in a specific direction, suggests that space-time itself is an emergent phenomenon arising from the quantum information structure of a more fundamental theory. The physicist Juan Maldacena's discovery in 1997 of the ADS-CFT correspondence, a precise mathematical duality between a theory of gravity in a negatively curved spacetime and a quantum field theory on the boundary of that spacetime without gravity, demonstrated that the geometry of spacetime, including its gravitational dynamics, could be completely encoded in the quantum information structure of a lower dimensional boundary theory. Spacetime, in this framework, is literally made of quantum information. The geometry of space and time, which we experience as the container of all physical events, is an emergent structure arising from the entanglement structure of quantum degrees of freedom in a more fundamental theory that has no geometry. Several physicists have drawn connections between this information-theoretic view of spacetime and the information-theoretic view of consciousness that IIT proposes. Both pictures say that the key object is integrated information, and that the structures we experience as most fundamental, spacetime in physics and consciousness in psychology, are both emergent from more fundamental information-theoretic structures. Whether this parallel is deep or superficial is unclear, but it suggests the intriguing possibility that the reason consciousness is so hard to locate in the physical world is the same reason that space-time geometry is so hard to reconcile with quantum mechanics. Both are emergent phenomena arising from a more fundamental information-theoretic reality, and the tools we use to describe them, geometry for spacetime and neural mechanisms for consciousness, are appropriate for the emergent phenomena but cannot penetrate to the underlying structure. The physicist Nima Arkani Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study has been one of the most vocal advocates of the view that spacetime is emergent and that the fundamental description of physics is in terms of abstract mathematical structures with no spatial or temporal meaning. Arkani Hamed's work on the amplituhedron, a geometric object in a mathematical space with no direct spacetime interpretation from which the probabilities of particle interactions can be calculated more simply than by using Feynman diagrams in spacetime, suggests that spacetime is a convenience, a derived description, not a fundamental reality. If spacetime is not fundamental, and if consciousness is related to the information-theoretic structure that underlies spacetime, then consciousness too might be more fundamental than it appears in the spacetime picture. There is something uniquely vertiginous about standing at the edge of what is known, looking out at the questions that remain genuinely open. Most areas of science are characterized by the slow, incremental accumulation of knowledge, the gradual filling in of details within a framework that is already broadly established. The molecular biology of the cell, the orbital dynamics of planets, the chemistry of materials, all of these are areas where the fundamental framework is secure, and progress is a matter of working out the implications. The science of consciousness is different. There is no secure fundamental framework. every major theoretical position is contested. The relationship between mind and matter, which seems like it should be one of the most basic facts about reality, remains genuinely undecided after centuries of inquiry. This is not a sign that the field is making no progress. It is a sign that the question is genuinely hard, and that the progress being made is the kind that involves revising fundamental assumptions rather than filling in details. The move from dualism to materialism in the modern period was progress. The recognition by Chalmers that materialism faces a genuine hard problem was progress. The development of IIT as a mathematically precise theory was progress. The experimental adversarial collaboration between IIT and global workspace theory is progress. The growing convergence between physicists working on quantum foundations and philosophers working on consciousness is progress. The direction of travel is clear, even if the destination is not yet in sight. What makes this moment in the science of consciousness historically significant is not that we are about to answer the hard problem. We are not, at least not in the next few years. What makes it significant is that for the first time in the history of science, we have mathematical tools precise enough to make concrete predictions about consciousness, experimental tools sensitive enough to test some of those predictions, and a theoretical conversation between physics and philosophy that is beginning to treat consciousness as a phenomenon of the universe rather than a mystery about the brain. The framework for a science of consciousness as a physical phenomenon, as something the universe does at a fundamental level rather than something brains happen to produce, is being assembled piece by piece. And this matters not just as an abstract intellectual achievement, but practically. If consciousness is fundamental to the universe, if it is not something that only complex biological systems produce, but something that matter does at every level in varying degrees, then the ethical implications are profound. The question of which systems deserve moral consideration becomes vastly broader and more urgent. The question of what we are doing when we create artificial intelligence systems becomes entangled with the question of whether we are creating systems that experience. The question of how we treat animals, how we treat the natural world, how we treat each other. All of these become questions not just about behavior and preferences, but about the distribution of experience in the universe and our responsibilities to that distribution. We are living through the early stages of what may be the most consequential scientific revolution in human history. The recognition that mind is not a byproduct of matter, but a partner in the deep structure of reality. The revolution has not yet happened. The evidence is not yet conclusive. The theory is not yet settled. But the questions have been asked in precise enough terms that they can now be pursued with the rigor of experimental science, and the direction of the pursuit is toward a universe that is, in some sense and to some degree, made of the same stuff as the awareness with which you are reading these words right now. Rest with that for a moment, in the quiet before sleep. The universe that produced you was not indifferent to its own existence. It was, from its first moments, organized in a way that made awareness possible. And the awareness you carry right now, this specific and unrepeatable and quietly miraculous fact of your existence, is the universe's most local and most vivid expression of what it has been doing for 14 billion years. Waking up, knowing itself, wondering what it is. You are that wondering. Sleep well. Tonight, we have traveled a long and unusual path. We began with the hard problem of consciousness, the question that David Chalmers named and that has refused to be solved or dissolved for 30 years. The question of why physical processes give rise to subjective experience, why there is something it is like to be you. We found that this question, seemingly a narrow question in philosophy of mind, reaches all the way down to the foundations of physics and all the way out to the structure of the cosmos. We found that panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is not produced by matter but is a fundamental feature of it, has moved from the margins of scientific discussion to something that serious physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers are engaging with rigorously. We found that Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory gives a precise mathematical account of what makes physical systems conscious, measuring consciousness as the integrated information a system generates as a whole beyond what its parts generate independently. We found that IIT, taken to its logical conclusions, implies that consciousness is distributed throughout the physical universe in varying degrees, and that the question of whether the universe itself has some form of consciousness is a mathematically meaningful question rather than a mystical speculation. We found that quantum mechanics, through von Neumann's chain, through Wigner's friend, through cubism, keeps returning to observers and to consciousness as something that cannot be fully removed from the formulation of the physics. We found that the fine-tuning of the fundamental constants raises the possibility that consciousness is not incidental to the universe's structure, but somehow built into its purpose or direction. We found Roger Penrose arguing that consciousness involves quantum gravitational processes that are non-computable, connecting the hardest problem in philosophy of mind to the deepest unresolved question in physics. We found Teilhard de Chardin's vision of a universe that evolves toward greater consciousness and integration. We found near-death experience research pointing, without definitively proving, toward a relationship between consciousness and the brain that is more like transmission than production. We found Hoffman's interface theory suggesting that space-time itself might be a product of conscious agents rather than the container they inhabit. And throughout all of this, we found the same idea returning in different mathematical and philosophical forms, that consciousness is not the universe's strange accident. It is what the universe was doing all along. The philosopher and physicist David Bohm once said that in some sense, man is a microcosm of the universe. Therefore, what man is a clue to the universe. We are not things the universe is doing accidentally. We are, if these theories are pointing in the right direction, the universe waking up. The 14 billion year process of cooling and condensing and coalescing and complexifying has been, perhaps, the universe finding its way back to itself, arranging matter into patterns of sufficient integration and richness to experience the wonder of their own existence. Right now, you are lying here at the end of a long day, at the end of a long chain of cosmic becoming. The atoms in your body were forged in stars that lived and died before the sun existed. The awareness in which those atoms are now embedded is, on the theories we have explored tonight, not foreign to those atoms. It is what matter does when it reaches sufficient complexity and integration. It is matter knowing itself. And that knowing, that awareness happening right now as you drift towards sleep, is, in the most literal and most profound sense that the science allows, the universe paying attention to itself. You are not a small thing in a large universe. You are the universe in its most local and most vivid expression, the most complex arrangement of matter that 14 billion years of cosmic evolution has produced. The place where the universe has, for now, chosen to be most awake. And as you close your eyes tonight and let that awareness soften and dissolve towards sleep, you are not turning off. You are returning, for a few hours, to the quieter register of awareness that underlies all the rest, the humming background from which all experience arises and to which all experience returns. The universe resting before it wakes again. Sleep well.